In the Philippines, it's shaping up like a defining moment of Rodrigo Duterte's presidency. As ISIS militants find themselves on the back foot in Syria and Iraq, could they really be trying to carve out territory in Southeast Asia? Militants who've been fighting a decades-long insurgency, storming Marawa City in the south and flying the black flag of Islamic State. This after the army tried to arrest one of their commanders last week. After recent attacks in Indonesia and Malaysia, the Philippines, a Catholic-majority nation, becoming a magnet for Islamic State militants. The fighting has proved tough. 90% of residents have fled, and while the Senate has now backed the decision by Duterte to impose 60 days of martial law for the South, the president also floating the idea of perhaps an extension to the entire nation. Would such an extension be warranted? Supporters of Duterte insist it's in no way an excuse to follow in the footsteps of the Marcos dictatorship, which cracked down for more than a decade in the 70s and 80s thanks to martial law. Critics don't see it that way, and they also fail to see the funny side of Duterte's quip about letting soldiers on the government side get away with rape. How does the commander-in-chief restore authority at a time when he's trying to negotiate with other militant groups? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the prospect of martial law under Duterte. With us from Manila, columnist Richard Hadarian, the author of Asia's New Battlefield. Welcome back to the show. Also joining us from the Philippines capital, Wilson Lee Flores, columnist for the daily newspaper, The Philippine Star. Thanks for being with us. From London, Sharif Al-Jabai, director of the Center for Study of International Peace and Security. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And from Washington, Zachary Abuza, who teaches Southeast Asia politics and security at the National War College. Thank you for joining the France 24 debate.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. It's been a week since militants overran Marawi City. 90% of its 200,000 citizens are said to have fled, mostly to nearby Iligan City, both on the island of Mindanao, a base for radical groups that include the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, Abu Sayyaf, and the Maute Group, the latter which overran Marawi. Josh Vardy has more.
I am going to create a new division for you. Para sa inyo. Wala nang qualification. Total, marunong naman kayo magbaril. Practice lang kayo ng kalabit. I am willing to take you, soldiers of the Republic. Lahat. MI, MN, pati NPA. Para ang sundalo ko halo-halo. Ngayon, yung mga lugar na master ninyo, doon kayo maghanap ng kalaban.
More from President Duterte later and react to that. First, let's get that report by Josh Vardy. All right, we'll try to go to that report by Josh Vardy a little bit later on. Let's get reactions now. First of all, Richard Hadarian, what do you make of the latest right now we're getting from inside of that we're getting from inside of the areas around Marawi City? Word that for now there is still house-to-house fighting going on, and that there are still insurgents holding out. What are you hearing? All right, we'll try to go to Richard Hadarian a little bit later on. Apologies for that. Zachary Abuza in Washington, what do you make of this takeover of the first of all, this shock that we saw 8 days ago with this parade of motorcycles in Marawi City with flying the black flag of ISIS?
The Maute group has been building up their forces for a couple years now in nearby region of this, so it's really no surprise. They are one of many groups that have pledged allegiance to the Islamic State in the southern Philippines. And part of the logic, it took this group, they declared allegiance in 2014. Such recognition was not returned by the Islamic State until early 2016. So there's always been a bit of competition amongst these groups for primacy. And I think the Maute group saw an opportunity to engage in violence against the state to burnish its position.
To burnish its position, and it sounds as though this attempt to capture this commander, who's on whose head there was a $5 million bounty by the FBI, backfired miserably.
Yes, and there's a long history in the Philippines of tactical raids having strategic consequences. In January 2015, there was a raid against another terrorist by Philippine security forces that led to the unraveling of the peace agreement with the much larger Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And it's very possible that the Philippine military was led into an ambush. It's certainly within the realm of possibilities here. But the peace process with the MILF unraveling has really had very important consequences to the rise of groups like the Maute group, because the MILF controls the territory surrounding Marawi City, and they've given these groups, these black flag groups, sanctuary. Without a peace process for them to without a peace process with the government, they really have nothing to offer their rank and file combatants who are feeling very let down and disaffected, and it plays into the narrative of these hardline groups.
Yeah, let's bring in Richard Haidarian on this. Richard, clear this up for us, because there are groups with which President Duterte is negotiating, and groups against which he's opposed. You heard there a moment ago Zachary Abuza mentioning black flag groups. There seems to be some kind of alliance. Who's in charge of what?
Well, as far as President Duterte is concerned, I think his biggest mistake in his first 10 months in office was just to obsessively focus on one issue and one issue alone, and that is his war on drugs. Now, it is unfair to say that he didn't care about peace process or didn't care about Mindanao. Remember, the communist rebels are also one of the major insurgencies in Mindanao. And Mr. Duterte focused on the peace process, but vis-a-vis the communist rebels. That's where much of the energy of Jesus Dureza, his peace negotiator, and Silvestre Bellio, he's also other peace negotiator and Department of Labor minister, was focused on, while he was not paying as much attention to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, a 12,000 strong insurgency, which was at the center of negotiations with the Philippine government under the Aquino administration, until the negotiations entered the dangerous stage of hibernation after the Mamasapana tragedy in January 2015, which your earlier guest was talking about. And then, of course, you have this aspect of Duterte actually doubling down on his old established personal ties with people like Nur Miswari, who actually launched a similar attack like the one in Marawi on Zamboanga City in 2013. So in short, President Duterte was not really that much focused on patching things up, pushing forward the peace negotiations, getting the Bangsamoro Basic Law passed, and really focusing his peace efforts on the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And the result of that is that it created this kind of peace vacuum that is increasingly being exploited by extremist groups. Now, add to that, this is where we have to be fair to Duterte, he should not be blamed for that, is the ISIS or Daesh pivot to the east as they get pounded in Mosul, and in the coming months, probably in Raqqa. So they're also looking at relocating, at finding alternative havens. This was the case in the 1990s when Al-Qaeda was relocating to Southeast Asia, when Jamaat Islamiyah was establishing bases in Mindanao. So we're seeing a new phase of this. And it seems now, finally, President Duterte recognizes that this problem could get out of control. And that's why, in fact, his martial law has been broadly supported by the public and much of the Congress and the Philippine political establishment.
Yeah, that's a point I want to touch on with you. Sherry Felgebele, you've been writing about this, the fact that as ISIS is on the back foot in places like Syria and Iraq, Southeast Asia can expect an attraction. And we've seen over the past 24 hours authorities in the Philippines saying there are foreign fighters there in Marawi.
Yes, that's right. So the Philippine Solicitor General has already reported that there are individuals from neighboring countries, from Malaysia and from Indonesia. But I think what's important to recognize is that irrespective of what's going on in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, the nature of Islamist extremism requires a breeding ground. And so really what needs to happen in the Philippines is a focus, of course, first and foremost to establish the security situation, but then in the aftermath, I think really there needs to be a stronger focus on the underlying roots and the root causes of the kind of attraction to Islamist extremism. These things like poverty, unemployment, and a variety of other social factors.
And as Zachary Abuza was mentioning at the outset, a bit of a power vacuum.
Right. Yes. So precisely. I mean, it's this idea that you need to engage with the local population, that you can't simply leave them without or ostracized from the political process, even if there is a certain degree of autonomy within that particular region. There needs to be better engagement from the government on a variety of levels. And that, I think, is going to be Duterte's next major challenge.
Better engagement with the local population. We saw and we heard it at the outset there, President Duterte offering the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the Moro National Liberation Front, to integrate them as soldiers with same pay, same privileges. I will build houses for you in some areas, he said. Wilson Lee Flores, let me ask you, is this a bit premature to be offering insurgents with which there are still negotiations going on, integration into the army?
I think as long as they could really accept the terms of the government, I think as long as they will really follow the president and the rules of the national government, I think it will be reasonable and not a problem to welcome them, because I think the government now is perceived by the people and even by the politicians to be really strong-willed. We have a government that has strong will, and there are a lot of military and police forces there. So I think it's not premature because it's not too much a problem, because if you don't integrate them, they will be unemployed and they will be maybe causing crimes and all these things. I think the good thing about this President Duterte, he is a local guy from Mindanao. For the first time in Philippine history, we have a national leader that is a local guy. And he even said that one of his ancestors was partly Muslim. So a lot of people trust his judgment. I think his judgment is based on actual local experience. So
how far it can go. So two things in what you're saying. I want Richard Hederian to rebound on them. On the one hand, here you have a president who is from Mindanao, from Davao City, and so who's closer to the area. And on the other hand, you heard saying it is possible to integrate them. Again, we heard at the outset, President Duterte saying, just practice pulling the trigger. I'm willing to take you as soldiers of the Republic. Is that going to work? Richard
Is this question
Hederian?
to me? Okay. Well, I mean, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that definitely President Duterte, I think his heart is Mindanao. His legacy wants his legacy to be peace and development in Mindanao. In fact, a lot of his good relations with China has to do with China's offer of major infrastructure investment in Mindanao. But sometimes that familiarity that brings some sort of complacency. I think President Duterte thought in his first 10 months, just because he has a background, a Moro background, that he's from Mindanao, he can just take the issue of peace negotiations for granted. And I think now he has realized that he has to translate that personalistic advantages into actually a much more systematic and institutionalized approach, because you cannot just rely on personal bonds to get very complicated issues like peace negotiations and counterterrorism going on. The second thing you have to keep in mind is that it also matters what the military thinks, and I'm not sure the military is very comfortable of fully integrating former rebels, former enemies, for some of them even current enemies, into the rank and file. So Duterte will also have to take into consideration what the military thinks. And I think if you look at all key issues, whether it's foreign policy, relations with China, with Russia, with the United States, the Philippine military is very influential. And on many occasions, Duterte had to walk back his initial statement precisely because he had to take into consideration the sentiments of the military. And then the third interesting thing here is that this morning it was revealed, and I actually had conversation with this person, Defense Minister Delphine Lorenzana said that perhaps martial law is not even necessary, and that even if a martial law has been declared, we have to make sure that this martial law doesn't trample upon the basic civil liberties and constitutional rights of the people. I mean, Secretary Lorenza just told me this today that they're going to make sure that Marcos-era abuses will not happen. So a lot of internal dynamics going on there, and we should not just be bound and confined to Duterte's statements, which are sometimes very controversial and very unorthodox.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of what's going on in your country, Zachary Abuza, the United States, where you sort of have to separate the rhetoric from the reality when it comes to Donald Trump. With Rodrigo Duterte, how much did you take him at his word when he talks about integrating other insurgents into the army?
I think he talks without thinking. This is a very complicated process. They tried this back in 1996 when they had a peace agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front. Very few of those combatants were actually integrated, and it took a piece of legislation to make it happen, and the military, as Richard said, really resisted this. So I think he's getting way ahead of himself. He declared martial law without really thinking through the consequences or having a strategy. And the strategy has to come back, and again, I completely agree with what Richard said, about having a holistic approach to the peace process with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. They are the largest force in the region, and they are a key stakeholder. And until they have a peace process that Duterte is willing to use his political capital and push through Congress, they have no incentive to be a real honest broker in this. And that's troubling. But they certainly have a key role to play in delivering peace to the region. No group has more influence than they do.
All right, we're going to pick up on this martial law, good idea or not. We've been asking you on the hashtag F24 debate. Stay with us. The France 24 debate continues.